Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Addis Dialogue with the program. I am Shifarao Lako, and I've got you a special guest today. He's Dr. Reidulf Molvaer. He's a very well-versed scholar who comes from Norway, and he has written a number of books on Ethiopian language and literature. He has also translated some of the best classic works of Ethiopians into foreign languages. And we're going to spend some time talking about his works and things like that. Do stay with us. Thank you so much for being my guest today.
Pleasure to be here.
All right, so you spent decades of your precious time, studying Ethiopian language and literature. You've also written a number of books on Ethiopian literature. You have also translated some of the classic works, such as Fikr Eska Maqaber. So all this makes me, come to the conclusion that you love Ethiopia so much. So can I ask why?
Well, it started in a way out of my control. I'm born in West Norway, but I came to Oslo when I was 15, and I lived in an international place, and I had friends from Japan, from Madagascar, from Latin America, and so on. But I had a dream of going abroad. And then there was one guy who was the director of the Evangelical College in Debre, who came to Oslo and met me and heard about my background, university studies, and said, "We need a person with your qualifications. Can you come to Ethiopia? Give me 1 minute. I'm coming." That's how I came here, and I stayed here for 10 years to begin with, and then I came back later.
All right. You wrote an entire book on Ethiopian writers, Ethiopian people who are known for their work. What's the reason behind this?
Well, let me rather start with the background. The first book I wrote about after 10 years in Ethiopia, I felt that I wanted to continue working here, but I felt that I had to learn more about Ethiopia so that I didn't come with my culture, but I did a job that I should do as a foreigner working in Ethiopia, but not making propaganda for my own life. So this is my doctoral thesis. And then I wanted to come back to Ethiopia, but during times there was a little bit problem about financing and employment, so I went to Kenya for several years. And then I came back to Ethiopia, and Ethiopians who had read that book, authors, said, "Now you have written about Ethiopian literature, now you must write about Ethiopian authors." Amara Mamo was one who pushed me to do it. And when I finally agreed, I said I don't know enough to write a book about the authors. But he introduced me so many people, and then people were willing to be interviewed and talk about their lives in literature. The result was this book. That was a follow-up of that book, actually. And people were so cooperative, they talked about themselves. Some of the authors were dead already at that time, so they talked about their memories of their parents and other relatives. So there are 33 people described in this book. And it continued. And I wrote also another book about child rearing in Ethiopia and how you use folk tales in Ethiopia and how you try to bring up your next generation. So that is one of the books. So, and at the same time, as I tried to learn Amharic, also tried to learn some Ge'ez, and I've translated a philosophical book from the 17th century to Norwegian also, from Ge'ez, called Hateta. And many things, let us say, you're not always in charge of your own life. Things happens, comes an offer, an opening, an opportunity. That's how in the 80s I came back to Ethiopia for 4 more years. And I found a manuscript about Yasu and Zauditu and Haile Selassie before he became emperor, when he was king, and translated that into Norwegian, into English, and it also became popular with some people. So one thing after another, and I wrote many historical articles for an American journal and so on. So in a way, I've always been a learner. Not telling you what you shall write about, what you shall do, but I'm asking what Ethiopians think, what I write about, what I think about their culture, and I'm a kind more of a transmitter of ideas rather than one who tells people it should be like this.
Impressive, really. So if I asked you, sir, one thing that's, most impressive about the authors of Ethiopian, classic works, what would be your response? What would your response be, sir?
Well, my attitude to literature on the whole is that, not as one person said that then you got only the viewpoint of the author. To make a novel, you have to have opposites, people who are different views. So it opened up many viewpoints on how you want your country to be, to develop. And I feel that I was brought up in countries where I write a lot of fiction, crime novels and so on, that is more for entertainment. But I felt that Ethiopian authors want something with their literature. I want to educate their own population, they want to come with viewpoints, but in a positive way, so that Ethiopia moves forward to become more, shall I call it, egalitarian and developed countries. And I find that literature isn't only for entertainment. It is entertainment or education in an entertaining way, so that it is, when you read about Fikrisk Mekabe, for instance, it is many entertaining things there, but the author wants something with a novel that is beyond entertainment.
Wow, I'm impressed again. Now, let me come to the translating thing, sir. You translated a number of classic works of Ethiopians, including Fikrisk Mekabe, Tobia, and also Araya, right?
Yeah.
So I'm impressed here, because translation, I think, is very hard, especially when you translate one language from one country into another. There's this cultural bound, things like that. So how did you manage to translate it in keeping with its culture, its the time, everything? It's really amazing. Can you tell me more about that?
Well, it started with my doctoral thesis. It isn't only impressions, it is a lot of references, quotations to literature. And the first time I read Fikrisk Mekabe was when I was writing my doctorate about Ethiopian literature. And I read a lot of books, but in very great detail. I didn't want to cheat by jumping over the difficult passages. And the one that used most of my time was Adefris. Oh, I read it, and I had a grandson of Platengeta Hirui, who was employed in London University. But it was so difficult, he didn't even understand it. So I used the dictionary of Desta Teklawal a lot. And then he said, explain the cultural context of all of it. So it was not enough to understand the words, but to see how it all fitted into an ongoing discussion about what Ethiopia should be like and what the authors thought about it and so on. So the books, many of the books I translated, I first studied for my PhD in London. And then I worked for 2 organizations in Norway before I felt it was good to work more with Ethiopia. So I suggested to some publishers, are you interested in African literature? And I found one who was really interested. And I showed him the original books that are thick. Oh, you write also thick books. I said, so the first one he wanted translated was Fikrisk Macabre. And I liked that book, so that we continued, and I translated Araya, I translated Tobia, I translated Ynkelf Lemine, folk tales, and in the end I translated a philosophical book from Goethe called Hateta. And I wanted to continue with a difficult book called Adefris, but then the author said, I want to cover the Horn of Africa, so now we do some from Kenya, some from Malawi, some from Sudan. So that was the last book I wrote from Ethiopia.
Are you translating it now?
Now I finished my, two books are in still with the publisher, but that is from Malawi. But the good thing is that the government has bought in all those books for all the public libraries in Norway. So anyone can borrow it from the libraries. And I paid the publisher for these books to get them into the libraries. So these books are available for anyone who wants to read about Ethiopia in Norway.
Wow, thank you so much. So this makes me ask you this question as well. Are other Norwegian scholars translating Ethiopian literature, or are you the only person doing that?
As far as I know, I am the only one who worked particularly with literature. But there are several Norwegians who are anthropologists and so on, who have worked with aspects of Ethiopia. And we have Norwegian doctors and Norwegian teachers, for instance. There has been a long connection between Norway and Ethiopia. But in literature, I think I am the only one.
This country that you love so much is now, as we speak, in the middle of different issues like pressures from foreign nations, meddling in the internal affairs of this East African nation. What's your message to European countries, to the West, as a person who knows Ethiopia very well?
Well, first of all, know what you are talking about, and not only take side with your friends and so on that might be part of the conflict, but go and observe the country, listen to the government program, not only take sides for or against without knowing what you are talking about. So there is much rubbish written in Norway also about Ethiopia. So I think more and more people are coming out with articles that is built on knowledge, because there are some people who have grown up in Ethiopia, and that doesn't help so very much. Some grew up as children because they were children of missionaries or teachers or so on, because children don't understand the political picture. But if they come back after some years, maybe know knowledge, and then try to understand the country, that is meaningful. But some will say, oh, I was born in Ethiopia, so I know it. But what the children learn about the country isn't so valuable, except as good memories. But there are some people who study Ethiopia very seriously from different angles.
Great idea raised here, sir. In this connection, I think the issue also comes from Western media outlets, some Western media outlets that are deliberately tarnishing the image of Ethiopia, deliberately trying to tarnish the image of this East African nation. So have you made some observations in this regard, and what do you feel about that?
Well, I am disappointed with much of what is written about Ethiopia lately in connection with the conflict and so on. But there are more and more people, I think, who become a little bit more sensible. You have a Tigrayan woman in America who's speaking for the government almost. I mean, trying to understand it, the viewpoint of the government. So there are more and more people like that. But there are some people who seem to serve only their own interests and so on. That is very disappointing, also in my country. But gradually, people are getting more enlightened. You see also African politicians come in and comment on Ethiopia, and because you have the African Union here and so on, they understand the situation and say, stop this rubbish that journalists who come in 1 week to Ethiopia and think they understand the situation in 1 week. No, there are some people now who really begin to understand Ethiopia. And from olden days, they understood it very well. In imperial days, there were people who really stayed here for maybe a whole lifetime to understand the country. Now there are people who come maybe a year for studies and so on and think they become specialists and so on. So there is much rubbish written and said, including very responsible institutions, but I think the more factual picture is coming out more and more actually. So I think actually Ethiopia is regaining its good image that it had in olden days before you started conflicts and so on now.
What is your message to Ethiopian scholars, to Ethiopian writers, especially in helping this East African nation properly promote against all these pressures that are coming?
Have, as journalists and writers, to publish as much as you can abroad also, not only for yourselves, because people do read about Ethiopia and Africa, but very often they read more what foreigners think instead of your own viewpoints. So be active in newspapers, in television programs and so on. And also let politicians speak out so that they not everything that is said by a casual visitor counts as a final truth about Ethiopia.
Thank you so much for those ideas.
Thank you for having me.
Well, dear viewers, with that we come to the end of today's program. Many thanks for having been with us. Until I see you next time with another program, it's goodbye from me, Shifarao Laka.
In this auspicious Ethiopian New Year, ETV English will bring you new programs that will inform and update you on major national and continental issues that matter. Sit tight and remain alert as we are bringing you new programs entitled Diplomatic Insights,